You're a former D1 athlete, former private equity investor, one of the most successful creator entrepreneurs out there. How can any of us be as successful as you've been?
The single thing that you need to focus on is,
what are some tangible actions we can all take to invest in financial wealth?
money isn't nothing. It simply can't be the only thing. All you need to think about is basically three things: identify problems, create solutions, and
You seem to be able to just bulldoze through hard things. Like, what drives you?
it's one of those things where you're like, everyone loves to talk about doing long-term until it's time to do long-term.
Well, Sahil, you're a D1 athlete, former private equity investor, one of the most successful creator entrepreneurs out there, and now hopefully we'll have a New York Times bestseller. So I'm curious for you, how can any of us be as successful as you've been?
Oh man, how can people be as successful as me? Well, the funny thing is, you will never feel successful unless you create your own definition of success. And for many of those moments and those highlights that you just shared, I did not actually feel successful, which is a hilarious thing to say now when you recite them. But that's the crazy thing about success is it doesn't matter if the outside world thinks you're successful if you don't feel successful internally. And if you're chasing someone else's definition of success, you'll never achieve it.
And I'm curious for you, through your journey, how has that feeling evolved? Like, how have you gotten to more maturity around actually understanding like what is successful for you, especially because you've hit all the different societal highlights?
I just think that so much of this comes down to identifying what actually matters to you, what you actually care about, rather than chasing the things that the world wants you, your parents want you to do, what your friends tell you, what culture tells you. But that requires a level of pausing and a level of questioning assumptions that most people are not comfortable to do. And it also just requires, very honestly, a sort of step away from the like scarcity mindset that you have during your 20s. And rightfully so. Look, to be able to say that you can have the pause, zoom out moment to start thinking about your like bigger picture things in your life when you're still rising through the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is unrealistic. In the early days, focusing on money and focusing on financial success is actually very important because it allows you to then get into a season of life when you can focus on some of these bigger picture questions. And so what I constantly say to people now is like, money isn't nothing. It simply can't be the only thing.
Yes.
And we all need that season when you are focused on that base and foundation building so that you can have the seasons later when you are able to step back and start thinking about the bigger picture of what does success actually look like to you.
I'm so glad you said that last point there, because when you were first talking about it, I actually had this emotional reaction come up in me, which was like, well, what about all the hard stuff in life you have to figure out first? And it brought me back to me as a kid. Like I came from a scarcity-based mindset. We had very little growing up. And I just remember having to work my way up through society and almost have to go through these learnings myself, like achieve these gold stars myself, to then have the learning of like, oh, wait a minute, like none of this stuff actually fulfills me. But you do have to hit some sort of certain baseline, right? And I think that is a privilege to get to do that. And so I'm curious if you think about the audience today that's listening that wants to be successful in all the conventional ways, but also likely find success in these more wholesome ways, what would be your advice of like how you can accelerate through that process as quickly as possible?
The single thing that you need to focus on if you want to build that financial foundation and base to get through that initial stage is figure out how to create immense value for everyone you encounter.
Yes.
This is not sexy. This is not going to sell an ebook saying like, here's the hack, here's the shortcut. It's the truth. The only way to make money is to create value. Money earned is a byproduct of value created. So all you need to think about tactically, just structurally, is basically three things: identify problems, create solutions, scale those solutions. The more scalable the solutions, the more value you'll create, the more money you'll make. So as you go about your life, whether you're working in a 9-to-5 job or whether you're an entrepreneur, the first thing you need to focus on is that first piece: identify problems. If you're working in a 9-to-5 job today and you're not happy with how it's going, you're not happy with how much you're getting paid, figure out problems that the people around you are experiencing. I guarantee you, if you take the initiative to identify a bunch of problems that your boss has, or that the customers have, or that your colleagues have, you propose solutions, and then you actually go and scale those solutions, you will get promoted and make a bunch of money. It's impossible to hold someone down that takes that initiative. Right now, when people get into a trap in their 9-to-5 jobs, it's because they operate in this mindset of like, well, my compensation is for my job description. So I'm going to do my job description. If you do your job description, you will get your compensation and you'll get your annual inflation raise every single year. And that's it. You'll never get more than that. That's the reality of the marketplace. If you want to have those step function improvements in your life that allow you to leap out of these different levels, that comes from creating an enormous amount of value on top of what's expected of you. That's just the reality of how the world works. And being willing to do that and actually look in the mirror and say, here's what's going to be required, and I'm going to be willing to do this to create that step function change, that's the piece that you need to break through.
I love that. I think there was a significant shift in my career, because you talk a lot about solving problems first and identifying the problem. Is I think the success in my career, it was like a monumental step function when I went from like me, how do I get me versus how do I think about how do I serve and help other people? And honestly, like a very cold utilitarian way, which is like you recognize, hey, if you solve someone's problem, they're gonna like line up at the door to give you money. And so I'm curious for you, as you think back to your career here so far, I don't know if you could share some of the war stories of how you've kind of gone through that process yourself.
Yeah, I think the way you articulated it is absolutely right too, by the way. The cold utilitarian approach early in your career is honestly probably the most effective, because the harsh reality is that your bosses don't care about you. Your employer probably doesn't care about you, with the exception of maybe a few that are out there. At the end of the day, if you're not creating value, you're going to be gone. If you decide you want to change jobs, they're not going to be your friends anymore. It's just the truth of how the marketplace works. And so you taking that approach and understanding that, and not being dark or morbid about that, but just accepting it, means that you are unlocked to then just think about your professional career that way in those early years. It's not a family. You are trying to lean in to create value for people in that marketplace. The way that I actually did that early on was this piece of advice that I received early in my career, which was to figure out how to swallow the frog for your boss. And all that means is identify something that your boss hates doing, learn how to do it, and then take it off their plate. If you do that, you are immediately valuable to the person that controls your progression, your opportunity set, and your compensation. And if you can do that consistently, you create this momentum early in your career that, again, is hard to hold down. You start getting pulled into new opportunities. You start getting pushed into, new areas that you previously wouldn't have. So I just really focused on that. Every single thing I could see that my bosses didn't want to do. It could be as stupid as like booking the car for the trip, or like making sure that coffee was ready for us when we were leaving. It can be simple remedial stuff, but it makes you invaluable and indispensable to an organization or to a situation. It's a way of literally creating value in seemingly innocuous ways.
I'm loving the visual right now. I'm imagining like young private equity associate Sahil going around and getting coffee and cars for his private equity partners. And actually, that brings up a realization that I just had is both you and I come from a pretty unconventional background for being a creator, which is we came from the private equity world, which isn't the most creative most of the time. And so I'm curious for you, how might your experience working in private equity have actually informed your success so far as a creator?
Great question. I think the number one way is I am willing to do literally anything. I have zero feelings of like being prideful about taking on the dirty, boring tasks on anything that happens. We literally just had this experience where, all the finished books came and I wanted to hand mail them out to people that I admired. So normally the typical way this is done is that you tell your publisher a list of names and addresses, and your publisher, like in their mail room, will just send out copies to people. But I didn't want to do it that way. I wanted to write handwritten notes to everyone I was sending it to. I wanted to put it into nice boxes, and I wanted to mark spots in the book that I thought that specific person would really appreciate in the book. My theory was that this was an unscalable thing that would create a scalable result, because then the more people would share it than normal. But what that required was 300 or so books being hand shipped from my house. And that meant literally a full week of like waking up at 3 a.m., handwriting notes, having my whole team there, hands on deck, like creating these boxes that we were putting together, hand shipping them. And no one is willing to do that kind of thing. Like it is insane behavior. It makes no sense, but I'm willing to do that because I come from this background where like I did that. I mean, I did it in my baseball years too, right? Like I was not talented in any way, really. I made it there because I was willing to put in work that no one was willing to put in. And I feel like it's partially informed by my private equity years, but more so it's informed by my dad. My dad from a young age I just remember learning from him that if you want to achieve extraordinary outcomes, you have to be willing to put in extraordinary inputs.
Yes.
There's no shortcut. There's no hack. The long way is the right way. And I have embraced that in things that I've done. Like I am always, if it's something that I care about, and if it's something that matters, I'm willing to do literally anything to make it happen.
But I think that's easier said than done in today's society of instant gratification. Like we're literally wired with our technology and everything that's set up to just want the quick result, like the get rich quick thing. So what would be your advice of how we can take a step back and be more thoughtful and more successful in what we do?
You need to stop pressing the eject button so quickly in life. What I mean by that is everything good in life is the result of compounding. It's the result of taking action today that is going to benefit you for the long run. It's doing hard things now that are going to have this long-term benefit. A lot of people say that and they tweet it and they like put it up on their wall. And it's one of those things where you're like, everyone loves to talk about doing long-term shit until it's time to do long-term shit. And then everyone becomes very short-term and they want the instant gratification. You have to really live by that idea. And what that means is you can't press the eject button as soon as it gets hard. And that applies to relationships just as much as it applies to business and money making. Like I see way too many people now, the second a relationship leaves the honeymoon phase, hit the eject button because I know on my phone I can have 100 options in a second. And the problem, logically, when you press the eject button too early is that you're not allowing yourself to go through the struggle that actually creates the benefit on the other side. You're literally stopping the compounding before it has a chance to take hold. And so, if you think about the equation for compounding, it returns to the power of time. Time is the exponent. Time is the thing that matters. You have to stay in it long enough. So when you press the eject button, you shut off the one thing that is actually going to matter and get you to the other side of this.
One thing I've learned from building Stan actually is anything worth really building takes 4 or 5 years plus to really see the efforts. And now after like years of eating shit and all the pain of building Stan, it's compounding in such a beautiful way that just like, I'm like so amazed by. But I'm curious for you, as you think about maybe a mental framework for evaluating whether or not something is worth your time. It's hard. There's like a gray line between this is going to be worth it, I should build this company, or like this relationship actually isn't the right thing. So I'm curious if you have any sort of mental framework for helping people understand which one they should actually go after and compound.
Yeah. I have this test that I say in the book called the new opportunity test, which is basically 2 questions that you ask yourself. So if a new opportunity comes up, the first layer is this a hell yes opportunity? Derek Sivers was the first person I heard talk about that, and I always really liked it. It's like, okay, is this a hell yes? If yes, you move to step 2. If it's not, you just say no right there. Step 2 is really important because very few people ever talk about this, but our bias when a new opportunity comes along or a new thing is to get really excited. You get the shiny object syndrome. You see the new opportunity and you're like, this could be the big thing. This could be amazing. We know this with new business opportunities. You're like, oh, maybe this could be huge. And so the second layer question is, if I assume that this opportunity will take twice as long and be half as profitable as I currently think, would I still want to do it? Then if the answer is still yes, you want to go do it. But if the answer is no to that question, you shouldn't lean into it. Because it's not going to be the thing that is truly naturally pulling your energy towards it. You're not going to be able to stick it out when you want to press that eject button.
Dude, I'm so impressed by how you have a mental model for literally everything.
I don't know if it's a good thing. Sometimes, it's funny. It's like, I get asked this question all the time. Like if you have so many mental models, like how do you just go through life being like, oh, mental model, this. And the way I honestly think about it is it's sort of like having a tool belt. Yeah. And, just because you have all the fancy, like intricate tools doesn't mean you're not just like basically using a hammer and a wrench in most situations. Like the hammer and the wrench take care of 90%. And then you might have, a few specialty tools in different areas. I have always found value in these frameworks and models in that they really help me articulate things to other people when they're facing situations. And my greatest joy in life is when I get to feel like I'm creating an impact for other people. And so if I can sit with someone and they're struggling with some situation and I'm able to relate it to some story and some idea and framework, and then it sticks with them much better than me just being like, I think you should do this. If I can kind of put a name to it, it sticks in their mind. And I find that creates this scalable impact in a very different way.
I love it. Well, I see it every day in your content, right? And I think what we should talk about now is actually your book that you're coming out with now. I told you this a couple of weeks ago. I sent you a random audio message out of the blue. I was like, dude, Sahil, I genuinely think that this book will change lives for the better, not only from a conventional financial wealth perspective, but also from all the other avenues that you talk about here in this book. So maybe I'll open the floor to you to just share what exactly is this book and why is it going to be so impactful?
Yeah. And by the way, I just want to say as a macro point, what you did sending that audio note, I got in the middle of a day, I was actually having a rougher day. Like a few things hadn't really gone well. And I get this audio note from John and I click it open, I'm listening to it. And it's this very thoughtful, very kind audio note from someone that I haven't seen in a while, telling me these nice things that they think the impact that I can create in the world. Completely changed my entire day.
I'm glad.
The way that I walked around the rest of the day and the way that I felt was completely different. And it's a perfect example of one of the types of wealth, which is something that I'm going to come to as we go. But I just wanted to say, I appreciate that. And the impact that can have if you do that one tiny thing for someone out in the world is enormous, the chain reaction it creates. So the 5 types of wealth that I talk about in the book. Time wealth, this is all about freedom to choose how you spend your time, who you spend it with, where you spend it when you trade it for something else. It's about awareness of the finite, impermanent nature of your time, of time as your most precious asset. Social wealth is all about your relationships. It's the people, your few close, deep relationships, and then the broader circles that you're connected to of people that are bigger than the self, communities, people. Mental wealth is all about purpose. It's about growth. It's about creating the space necessary in your life to wrestle with these bigger unanswerable questions, whether through spirituality, religion, meditation, solitude. Physical wealth is all about your health and vitality. It's about controlling the controllable actions to fight against the natural decay and atrophy that you go through as you age. And then financial wealth, which is what we all know, money, net worth, with the one caveat of a real focus on this idea of enough, what it means to have enough. Recognizing that your expectations are actually your greatest financial liability, because if your expectations rise faster than your assets, you will never feel rich. The whole concept here of this 5 types of wealth is that it should be the new scoreboard for your life. What I recognized on my own journey was that the scoreboard is what's broken. You are focusing so narrowly on the one thing that you can measure about your life, which is money. And as a result of that narrow focus, you may win that one battle, but you will lose the broader war, which is a fulfilling, happy, content life. There are all of these other things that are important, but we haven't had a way of measuring them. We haven't had a way of actually looking at them on our scoreboard. And as a result, you don't take actions to build those things. We know this as humans, that the things that we can measure end up being the things that we focus on and build around. So what I recognized was that we needed a way to actually think about and measure these other areas of our life. Because when you measure the right things, you take the right actions, and then you create the right outcomes.
I love that. But I think in some ways, though, it's easy to say that these are all important. But I think one thing that I want to dig in on with you and get your thoughts on is why have we as a society just been bamboozled into focusing on one form of wealth?
I don't know that it's bamboozled as much as I would just say that Peter Drucker, the management theorist, articulated this perfectly. What gets measured gets managed.
Sure.
And money it's a number. It's just by default. It is a feature for money because it has made it very easy to transact and build societies, and capitalism has all functioned around it. But as a result, it becomes the one thing that we value and the one thing that we focus on. You know these other areas matter, but because there's no way to put kind of a framing to it, you don't invest in them in the exact same way that you would. And that is really important because when it comes to financial wealth, you know that $100 invested today is going to be worth a lot more in the future. It compounds over the long term. The exact same principle applies to your relationships. Tiny investments in your relationships today compound over the long term. A little bit today is much better than zero today, and it's going to build. But we don't have that mindset around these other areas because they haven't been part of this scoreboard in our life. So then when decision points come, we don't factor them in. You go take the job that's going to take you 3,000 miles away from your family for an extra $10,000 a year. You don't factor in this impact on your social wealth, on your mental wealth. You don't factor in that this job is going to make you miserable in your health. You're not going to be sleeping ever. Like, you don't factor these things in when you make the decision. And so then you wake up one day, and you've lived 50 years of your life and you wonder what the hell you just did. But that's why. It's because all along the way, you were focused on the battle at the expense of the bigger war.
I think what comes up for me in that is a question of human nature. So I'll project out my own experiences growing up. So I grew up, immigrant kid, very few people look like me in the South. And I think growing up, all you want to do is fit in as a kid, right? Middle school, high school, what have you. We've all had our trauma through that. And I just remember just assuming, or I just subconsciously just started building towards financial wealth because I had some sort of assumption that would fill all the holes inside of me that I think the other four forms of wealth actually do. And I'm curious for you, why do you think we as human beings kind of naturally gravitate towards that as the answer?
So there's actually a pretty clear scientific reason, which is when you are young and as you are coming up the early income curve in your early years of your life, there is a very clear correlation between money and happiness in those early years. An incremental unit of money drives an incremental unit of happiness in a simple model because it's reducing these fundamental burdens and stresses. You're able to afford food and shelter. You start being able to take care of the people around you. You can afford a vacation or 2 vacations a year. It drives legitimate happiness gains in your life. So we kind of get patterned into this idea that when you ring the money bell, you get the cheese. And I think Arthur Brooks was the one that originally started talking about this, that patterning is very hard to break. You pattern your mind into saying more money equals more happiness, and you don't acknowledge when that curve starts to flatten out. So you continue to think as you get past $100,000, $200,000 a year, whatever the numbers might be for you in your life, you continue to think that the incremental unit of money is going to be what drives the incremental unit of happiness because you've been patterned to believe that. Because it's been true in the past, but you have changed. The season that you were in has changed. Your life considerations have changed, but you're not able to recognize that in the moment if you don't have a framework for thinking about it.
You know what I'm thinking? It's such a typical trope to hear of a story of someone who comes from nothing, is really struggling, and then works so hard to build all this financial wealth. Then on the other end, they're miserable and alone and depressed. And so I'm curious if you could help us get more tangible on this. You just mentioned a scoreboard. We have to measure what matters. So could you help us all avoid that fate and be a little bit more fulfilled and happy? What are the ways we can get really tactical here and start to measure these forms of wealth?
Yeah. So in the book, there is an actual kind of score that you can put to this, which is it's based around your responses to these different statements across each type of wealth. The way that we did it, my wife and my life, and my own journey to try to dramatically change the trajectory. I mean, I haven't mentioned this, but like 4 years ago, I was extremely lost in my life and where I was. I was, chasing money and doing very well at that one game at the expense of everything else in my life. My relationships had really started to suffer. I wasn't seeing my parents ever. My relationship with my sister had ground to a halt. My wife and I were struggling to conceive at the time, which was creating a lot of strain. I was drinking 7 nights a week. I was really unhealthy physically, mentally. All of these areas of my life had started to suffer, while on the outside looking in, you would have said I was winning the game. And when we stepped off this track and this path and decided to make a change in our life, that was the first thing I did, was start to figure out, okay, what is a baseline way of measuring this broader perspective on my life? So if you were doing well in financial wealth, take an inventory of your life across these other areas. Take a look at your calendar. How much control do you have over your week? Over what you're spending your time on during the course of a week? That's time wealth. Social wealth. How are your relationships? If at 3 a.m. you had a problem, how many people are there that you could call that would pick up the phone? That's a good definition of whether you are lonely or not. If you don't feel like you have people you can call in the middle of the night, that is loneliness. So ask yourself those questions. Do you feel like you have those few deep connections? Do you feel like you have some broader network or community of people that you can turn to, something bigger than yourself in some way? Mental wealth, do you feel like you understand what your higher order purpose is? What is the reason you're waking up every morning? What is the thing that you're trying to connect to on a daily basis that's giving you life, that's actually life-giving for you? Do you have one or not? And then physical wealth, do you feel like you are in control of your body's future? Do you feel like you are taking the actions necessary to make sure that when you wake up at 80 years old, you're able to carry your grandkids up and down the stairs?
You know what I'm just realizing that's really cool about the framework you've set out with the 5 types of wealth is it also is a way for us to, as humans, because we're all different, figure out what is our hierarchy of values. So what came up for me just now is when you talk about social wealth and at 3 o'clock in the morning, could you call, how many friends could you call? I felt such a visceral emotional reaction in myself. I was like, wow, that's the one that matters to me. I was like, I'm so grateful for all the wonderful people in my life. And then as you were going through the other forms of wealth, I was like categorizing them of like what matters most to me. And I think then it's, physical wealth and mental wealth. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think that social wealth, that idea of relationships, I personally believe that relationships are what allow you to experience any of the other types of wealth to the fullest. No one dreams of having a private jet or a yacht and being alone.
Yeah.
No one wants to be on a yacht by themselves. You dream of having those things so that you can experience them with other people. No one wants to be, super fit and healthy, but have no one to go on the hike with. You want people. People are what create the texture. And scientifically, there is very clear scientific evidence that the strength of your relationships determines your entire life.
Yes.
The Harvard study of adult development was this amazing study done over the course of 85 plus years. They tracked the lives of 1,300 original participants plus 700 descendants. And they found that the single greatest predictor of physical health at age 80 was relationship satisfaction at age 50. Not your cholesterol, blood pressure, smoking, or drinking habits. How you felt about your relationships impacted how you aged,
That's
how
so
you were
insane.
at age 80. So what better reason to invest in those things in the exact same way that you think about investing in your financial wealth? And furthermore, there is clear scientific evidence that the people you surround yourself with determine your outcomes as a human being.
Yep.
The Pygmalion effect is this idea that we rise to the level of expectations that others have for us. So if you surround yourself with people who think you are capable of more, who push you to think bigger, who tell you to dream on, who encourage you and lead you forward, you will rise to the level of those expectations. And if you surround yourself with people who do the opposite, who belittle you, who tell you to be realistic, who push you down, you'll fall to the level of those expectations. So you have to choose so wisely about who you let into your energy. Who are you giving your precious life energy to in your world?
I'm curious for you now. You're so wise with the frameworks, and you've gone through so much turmoil and struggle to then now get to the other side where you're building this life for yourself. And in my mind, what I equate Sahil Bloom to sometimes is just your daily Instagram stories at 4 a.m. in your ice bath. And I'm curious for you. You seem to be able to just bulldoze through hard things. Like, what drives you? What gives you the fire to actually do those things?
I fundamentally think of discipline as being about an act of service to your future self. It is the willingness to do the thing to try to create the future that you have in mind for who you are as a person. And I think that manifests in different ways for different people. I was having a conversation with a young woman today who told me that she really struggles with discipline in different areas of her life. And then she was talking about how she's really loving these different creative things that she's doing and how she, wakes up and has all this energy for this different work that she's taking on. And I kind of pushed back on her and I was like, I actually think you're quite disciplined because you are acting in service of your future self. You need to give yourself a little bit more grace to recognize that discipline doesn't mean waking up at 4 a.m. to get in a cold plunge. It might mean it for me, but it doesn't have to mean it for you. Being disciplined means really taking on the things that matter to you to create the future you have in mind for yourself. Not the future that I have in mind or the future that John has in mind, but the future that you really care about. And so that's really, that's a meta point with this entire book is my map is not your terrain. Your map is not my terrain. So much of the dialogue and the arguments that you see online are about one person taking their map and trying to apply it to someone else's life and terrain. Like you see, Brian Johnson is a classic example of this. He's trying to live forever. He has this whole movement, don't die. And the most common criticism you see is, oh, he's not living. Like he's doing all these things. He's not living. He is living his best life. Yeah. His definition of success is doing all these crazy things. It's not mine. It might not be yours, but it's definitely his. And I've spent time with him. He is living his good life. And so it makes no sense for me to try to apply my map to his terrain. For me to say, oh, he's not living. He might not be living under my definition, but he is very much living under his.
Yeah.
The same thing applies to discipline. My version of discipline is doing these like weird, crazy things on a daily basis. I get up at 4, I get in the cold plunge. I, do my workouts. I eat the same food basically every single day. That's because that makes me happy. I genuinely enjoy doing those things. Not during them. It sucks. I hate it. But in the macro, I really enjoy being the type of person that I feel like I'm serving my future self by doing these things. But you need to find that version that works for you in your own life, if that makes sense.
It does. And what's funny is in my head, I'm saying, well, Sahil's justifying to me that I love eating fried, unhealthy food. So that's my future self. But it does bring up the quote for me that is, discipline is one of the greatest forms of self-love. Mm-hmm. And I like how you talk about your future self and building into that. So I'm curious for you, when you think about your future self, when you're riding off into the sunset, let's say in a couple of decades, what have you achieved?
I hope I have a few more than a couple decades. We'll see.
Many decades, many decades, centuries.
And by the way, on your point about, eating fried chicken, if your like version of your ideal life is that you get to eat foods that you like, I don't think you should do that every single meal for a very specific reason, which is you will enjoy it less if it's at every single meal than if you make it a treat. And you'll also get to do it for less time because you'll die much younger if you do that. So find a way to build those things that you love into your life. I mean, honestly, if you love good food, you don't need to just remove that completely from your life because other people have told you that, you'll harm your life. Like all the debates around red meat and whether it is it going to cut years off your life? I love a steak. I love steak. If you told me that like, hey, it was going to have some impact on my longevity, like, okay, but I love steak. We make trade-offs like that every single day. That's part of what life is. You're deciding to do certain things. And so figure out what works for you. To your question, riding off into the sunset. My ideal future is, I have a very clear vision of this. Sitting on a porch with my wife by my side, my kids all around us, grown children, spending time with us chatting, grandchildren running around in the yard, and a whole bunch of friends coming over for a big dinner. If I have that, I am the wealthiest man alive. And the cool thing about that is I think I can create that future. Yeah. By taking pretty specific actions today, most of which have to do with things other than money. I'm not in some like insane mansion. It's not on a private jet. There's money involved to some extent, but for the most part, that's about me investing in relationships, doing the things with my kids so that they want to hang out with me when they're adults. My wife's still by my side. That means I'm investing in my most important relationship with her. Having friends that want to come over and hang out. Feeling healthy enough to do that when I'm 80 or 90 years old means I'm investing in my health in those ways. And feeling some level of purpose and fulfillment on a daily basis means I'm continuing to do things that create energy for me, continuing to feel like there's a reason for waking up in the morning. All of that is how I think of the ideal future I'm trying to create. And then the question to me is, once you identify that ideal future, come back to the present and say, am I taking actions today that are conducive to creating that future that I just invented for myself? Yes or no? I think that I am today, but on a monthly basis, I ask myself that. And if I ever feel like I'm getting out of whack, then I probably need to make some adjustments.
I love it. What that brings up for me is, I think one thing we all know pretty well at this point, it's like common knowledge in society, is the tangible actions required to invest in your financial wealth. And you mentioned relationship wealth here. What are some tangible actions we can all take in our day-to-day in order to build that relationship wealth?
I'm going to come back to you because I think what you did, sending me that voice note, is the simplest way that you can invest in your relationships every single day, which is make a rule that every single day you're going to reach out to one person and just tell them something nice that you thought about them. It can be as simple as a one-line text message, just saying, hey, I was thinking about you. I hope you're doing well. Or it could be a voice note, or it could be catching up for a coffee, or it could be calling your parent. Whatever that thing is, make a rule that every single day you are going to do some tiny investment in your relationships, in your social wealth. That compounds better than any financial investment. And the reason is because what happens by default is we think we don't do that. We don't invest in those relationships in the same way that we do in our finances. We know with finances, investing $10 today is better than zero. Relationships follow the exact same rule. So either you invest in them and they compound positively, or you do nothing and they atrophy. That's the funny thing. Like, everyone shows that graph from Atomic Habits of 1% improvement every day and you go to 37x. I think the most important part of that graph is what happens if you go minus 1% every day. It zeroes you out. By the end of the year, you literally get zeroed out. That is what happens if you just don't invest in these areas. It's a negative. You are negative. You are moving negatively. And rewriting that script is as simple as doing that one tiny action every day. So for social wealth, just take a second to do something like that. Be the catalyst in these relationships. Don't wait for other people to text you because you're saying like, well, it's always me. Being prideful about relationships never got anyone anywhere worth going.
I love that. So one thing I've been obsessing about lately is making impact at the systems level. As in, I think the lucky hundreds of thousands, hopefully millions of folks who read your book, you're going to fundamentally change how they think for the better. But the struggle I have and the worry I have is that's just the rare lucky few. And even in that, when I think about our day-to-day in the system we live in of capitalism and the media and just the society we live in, it's all incentivized just towards this one form of wealth. And so I'm curious for you, how would you literally restructure the system that we live in, like of society or how we operate, in a way that you think you could actually help the entirety of the population start to be aware of these forms of wealth and then also actually invest in them?
Fascinating question. I really do believe in the power of ground movements to change the world. And what I mean by that is, I think that most fundamental change starts at these like grassroots levels. And when I think about books that have actually fundamentally changed the world in some way, most of them had this like grassroots movement. Susan Cain is the author of this book, Quiet, which was all about the power of introverts in an extroverted world. We live in an extroverted world, a world that prizes and celebrates loud, talk more, powerful, stand up straight, all these things. That's not how everyone's wired. She wrote a book that created this grassroots movement that has infiltrated companies around the world. There's literally Quiet ambassadors at different big companies all over the place. She's had an enormous role in that. Her TED Talk talking about this has 100 million views. Huge impact. I think there is the potential, if people really have these ideas incepted in their mind, to start to shift how we think about and value each other, which starts to create this movement. Because one of the challenges on a systems level is you may say, okay, well, I value these other things. Here's how I'm going to build my life. But if you walk into a room and the first thing that you think about is like, oh, well, that person's way richer than me and that person, you start comparing yourself to all these other people on that single plane again, you default back into your old ways around it. If you start having big groups of people walking into rooms thinking much more about the broader perspective on a wealthy life that people are living, and you start having people value that in other folks, and you start having people want to level up in that broader game of it, I think more and more people start to then try to push themselves in these other areas rather than in the one area. The reason I think this is because I think we've seen it happen when it comes to physical wealth over the last couple of years. There's been a very prominent vibe shift in my mind, especially in like these coastal cities, where health has become more of a flex than money. I get way more questions now from like very successful businessmen and entrepreneurs about the things I'm doing for my health, like how do you get a six pack? Like how do you do this? How do you do like all seriously, those things stand out much more now and get much more attention than having a Rolex on your wrist.
Totally.
And I can see that happening, and I want to see it happen with all of these areas now. I want to see like calendar control, like real time wealth, that understanding be a flex. I'm starting to see more dads talk about spending time with their kids as a form of wealth. Like there are these vibe shifts that you can see starting to happen, and I want to see that just continue to propagate, because I do think that power is with the people on these things. Like if you start to fundamentally change how you value other people, the people you are attracted to, the people that you are going to celebrate, if we start celebrating people who have built across the 5 types of wealth rather than the one, if we start writing books about people that have built across these other areas of life rather than just money, that is a big, big change. And that's an important point because like I realized, my entire life changed when I realized that the people that I read books about are not people I would ever want to trade lives with.
Yeah.
You read all these books about these famous, successful businessmen. I wouldn't trade lives with them. You would have to pay me. There was no amount of money that I would pay.
Right. At what expense is that success?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Money costs too much. I think Emerson said that. It's true sometimes. Yeah. Like if the cost of being a mega billionaire is having 3 divorces and 4 kids that don't want to talk to me, count me out. I have zero desire. I'd rather make $100,000 a year and have loving relationships with people around me. And I really mean that. I'm not like, I turned down a lot of money by stepping off the track that I was on. I'm sure I'll do fine, and I do fine, and I have a great life, and I like money. It's not like I hate money or something. I just value these other things, and the path that I'm on is one that allows me to embrace them, and it doesn't get me caught into a trap where I feel like I'm focusing on the one thing at the expense of everything else.
I love it. All right, I've got final questions for you, Sahil. Let's do a little rapid fire round. If you could have one thing written on a billboard that the entire human population could see, what would you put on it?
Reject the default, live by design.
Why is that resonant for you?
I think the world would be a much better place if people learned to reject these default settings of meaning and purpose and success that we've all been handed, or at least question them and create their own versions of those.
Next question. Who are your role models out there?
My dad. My dad has always been my role model. I don't think I articulate that enough to him, but the way that he's built his life, focused on love, focused on his purpose, playing the games that he wanted to play and saying no to all the others, I just have admired so much.
I've learned that it takes immense strength and conviction to play games that matter to you and not the ones that you're told to. I'm curious where one might derive that strength.
I think it comes from a level of self-awareness and comfort and genuine joy at your current place, where you are. You can feel that in a person when you spend time with them, by the way.
Yeah.
When you sit down with someone, they almost have an aura about them.
Yeah.
That like, it's not that they're so rich or successful or the thing. They just are so comfortable with who they are as a person that you can't help but be attracted to this aura that they have. And they're not chasing all the million different things. It's almost like they are standing still in a world that's like moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And when you meet someone like that, it really stands out because it's so rare in modern society.
Yeah, it's just this aligned authenticity, and you can feel the vibration, you can feel the energy of it. Final question for you, which is that you've mentioned that this book covers many questions rather than the answers. So I'm curious for the audience, if you could leave them floored with questions that are just going to rock them in their socks, what are the top questions they can ask themselves right now?
If someone were to come and watch you for a week, what would they say your priorities are? There are 2 types of priorities in life. There are the priorities we say we have, and then there are the priorities our actions show we have. Usually there's an enormous gap between those 2. You say one thing, but then your actions bear out a completely different thing. What is that gap? How big is it? And how can you close that gap by aligning your actions with what you say you actually care about? The last one I'll leave you with is, am I hunting antelope or chasing field mice? This, I think, comes from Newt Gingrich, the former politician in the United States. Antelope are the big, meaty problems, the big, important problems in life. Field mice are the stupid, urgent ones. Am I hunting those antelope, those big, important problems, or am I just chasing around these tiny little urgent field mice?
Wow, what a mic drop.
I like that one.
So Sahil, I'll hold up the book here for everyone. Guys, this is the 5 Types of Wealth. I truly, genuinely, personally could not recommend this enough. Like, I was the one who asked Sahil to come on because I really think this is going to be so helpful. But Sahil, where can people actually find this book?
You can get the book now anywhere books are sold. Amazon, obviously. If you have a favorite local bookshop, go and get it there. You could find more information at the5typesofwealth.com. And you could find me at Sahil Bloom on any major platform.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Sahil, it was great to have you on the pod.
Thank you.
All right. Go buy it, guys.